Well, yesterday was one of those days that I seem to be having more and more of lately. At 11 o'clock yesterday morning, I preached a memorial service here in this sanctuary, and then at 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon, performed a wedding in the backyard of one of our attendees, and I want to tell you, they were wonderful experiences. Both of those services were celebrations of life. They were celebrations of God's blessing. That memorial service was a service that celebrated the life of a man who lived 91 years. And it's just a wonderful celebration whenever you can come together and remember a person who's lived that long and that faithfully. And the wedding that I performed brought together in marriage two people who deeply loved each other. And so last night I was thinking about my day. I was just sort of reflecting on all that had happened. I had a memorial service. I had a wedding, and I even got to watch an Aggie football game where the Aggies won. I thought as I look back, I thought, man, what an amazing job I have. I mean, seriously, what an amazing job. I got to help two people take the next step in their relationship in a Godward way. And then earlier in the day, at the memorial service, I had the privilege of loving a family of a man who had died after spending 91 years on this earth, and then telling the people who were attending that service that I believed he was celebrating the first days of his existence in eternity with Jesus because of the way in which he lived his life on this earth and proclaimed his faith in Jesus. And then I got to tell people how they could receive the same victory over death in their lives should they choose to follow Jesus as he did. And I thought, man, this is a great job. Yeah, it stinks sometimes, but it's a great job. And yesterday was one of those days where I just had the privilege of just being a pastor to some people. And then today, I get to stand up in front of you and tell you much the same thing I said yesterday. I get to talk to you about how to live your life in such a way that God is glorified and that Jesus is magnified. I got a book in my office. It's a book that was written by John Piper, and the title of the book is Don't Waste Your Life. Now, I didn't put a subtitle for this sermon, but if there was a subtitle for this sermon today, that would be it. Don't waste your life. And all the relationships that you have in your life, especially when it comes to your friendships, don't waste your life. That's what I believe was going on in the New Testament book of Ephesians, where Paul was instructing those Christians who lived in Ephesus about how to live their lives in such a way that they did not waste a single minute of their day. He wrote this in Ephesians 5. He said, imitate God, therefore, in everything you do, because you are his dear children. Live a life filled with love, following the example of Christ. He loved us. He offered himself as a sacrifice for us, which is a pleasing aroma to God. Let there be no sexual immorality or impurity or greed among you. Such sins have no place among God's people. Obscene stories, foolish talk, coarse jokes, these aren't for you. Instead, let there be thankfulness to God. You can be sure, he said, that no immoral, impure, or greedy person is going to inherit the kingdom of Christ and of God. For a greedy person is an idolater, worshiping the things of this world. So don't be fooled by those who try to excuse these sins. For the anger of God is going to fall on all who disobey him. Don't participate in the things these people do. For once you were full of darkness, but now you have light from the Lord, so live as people of light. For this light within you produces only what is good and only what is right and only what is true. So carefully determine what pleases the Lord. Take no part in the worthless deeds of evil and darkness. Instead, expose them. It's shameful even to talk about the things that the ungodly people do in secret, but their evil intentions will be exposed when the light shines on them, for the light makes everything visible. This is why it is said, "Awake, O sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will give you light." So be careful how you live. Don't live like fools, but live like those who are wise. Make the most of every opportunity in these evil days. Don't act thoughtlessly, but understand what the Lord wants you to do. So when it comes to the relationships that we have with other people, specifically those relationships that we have with our friends, I can't think of a more profound and instructive passage of Scripture than what I just read from Ephesians chapter 5. In fact, he starts off with what I would consider the best advice any of us could ever hope to be given when it comes to relationships. And he gives it in 2 words. The first 2 words of the text: imitate God. Imitate God. I mean, think about it. I mean, if you figure out how to do that, just to imitate God, to love like he loves, to care like he loves, to follow the path he's placed before you, to imitate. If you could figure out how to imitate God and stick to it, man, you'd be home free. Imitate God. I like how Eugene Pearson translates the opening 2 verses of that text I just read. He says it like this: watch what God does, and then you do it, like children who learn proper behavior from their parents. Mostly what God does is love you. So keep company with him and learn a life of love. Observe how Christ loved us. His love was not cautious, but extravagant. He didn't love in order to get something from us. He loved in order to give everything of himself to us. Love like that, he said. Let me ask you, does that describe the love that you have for your friends? Not cautious love, but extravagant love. I've known people who love like that. I mean, they're the kind of people who are willing to be vulnerable in their relationships rather than guarded. They're the kind of people who literally throw themselves into situations with their friends because they believe they truly have something that God has given them to offer, not because they're going to get something out of it. I mean, you heard what Paul wrote, that Jesus didn't love in order to get something from us, but to give everything of himself to us. You know, I know people who pursue friendships only with those people who they believe will give them something in return. Don't spend your life like that, Paul's saying here. Give yourself away in your friendships with regard not for what you will get back, but for what you can give. I mean, that's the kind of friend that creates a pleasing aroma to God. And then Paul offers some guidelines for the ways in which we ought to behave in our friendships. And what he says here, I believe, needs to be repeated over and over and over again. He says, let there be no sexual immorality or impurity or greed among you. Such sins have no place among God's people. Obscene stories, foolish talk, and coarse jokes, these are not for you. Instead, let there be thankfulness to God. You know, I want to tell you, I believe my grandmother would never have imagined that this would be something that we desperately need to talk about in church. Because when in the day in which she grew up, in her mind, the only circles that were worthy of this kind of admonition applied to those people who adamantly rejected Christianity, people who were hostile to the church. Little did she know that just 3 decades after she died, the very things that Paul talks about in those verses that I just read are normative when it comes to the kind of stuff that people binge watch every single day. I mean, when I was growing up as a kid, Three's Company was the show that probably crossed the most lines when it came to appropriateness and inappropriateness. Who's seen Three's Company? It's okay. It's okay. Soap operas, when I was growing up, were the most risque programming that you could find available. I mean, now that stuff's child's play. I say that because there is not a doubt in my mind that the stuff that we watch on whatever screen that we have in front of us impacts how we treat the people around us in real time. There's no question in my mind that that's true. And so what Paul says here in Ephesians 5 is a very important word for all of us in this day and age, or in this desperate time, as he would say a little bit later. He says, keep yourself pure. Guard your eyes. Guard your heart. Honor God with the way you treat people of the opposite sex. As Eugene Pearson puts it, don't allow love to turn into lust, setting off a downhill slide into sexual promiscuity and filthy practices and bullying greed. Keep yourself pure. Why do you think Billy Graham never went to lunch or dinner alone with another woman? Because of this. Because of this. And then watch your mouth, he says. I mean, pay attention to the things that you say to other people. I mean, there's really no place for obscene stories and offensive jokes, he says here. Yeah, I had a teacher when I was in college who it was actually my voice teacher, and I was in a vocal class with three other guys, and there were times when we could be college boys and we would tell jokes and say things that we probably shouldn't have said. And she would always stop us dead in our tracks by saying, would you say that to your mother? Just honor God with the conversations that you have with your friends. And that includes things like gossip. You know, I know it feels good sometimes to talk about a person that you don't particularly like. You know, just get a little dig at that person. I mean, who knows? You may somehow convince the person that you're talking to about this person you don't like. You may convince that person you're talking to start thinking like you think about that person. Stop that nonsense. Is it helpful? Does it build the other person up, or does it tear the other person down? And of course, Paul acknowledges, of course he would have to say this, he acknowledges that there will be people who think it's foolish for you to think about stuff like this. You know, like they'll say things like, oh, you're just being oversensitive to what you heard me say. Or, it was just a joke. Or, I didn't mean anything by that. Or they'll say, we just had lunch together. It's nothing really. Or, oh, boys will be boys. And then my personal favorite, I know I shouldn't say this, but. You know what that, I put all caps on the word but, because you know what that means? What that word but means is I really didn't mean what I just said before the word but. Because every time a person says, I know I shouldn't say this, but then they go ahead and say what they shouldn't say. We do that all the time. Paul says, don't be fooled by those who try to excuse these sins, for the anger of God is going to fall on all who disobey him. Don't participate in the things these people do. And then he really brings it home. He says this, for once you were full of darkness, but now you have light from the Lord. So live as people of light, for this light within you produces only what is good and only what is right and only what is true. You see, there was a time in your life when you didn't know better. Actually, you did know better. It's just that you were motivated by darkness. You were motivated by the culture. You were motivated by the world, not by God. And do you understand what he's talking about when he talks about darkness and light here? Now, I know that some of you are I don't know, I'm a Star Wars fan. And I believe George Lucas hit the nail on the head when he said that there's a dark side. That there is this ever-encroaching power of evil and darkness that threatens everything that is good and right and true. This is what John was talking about in his gospel, at the very beginning of the Gospel of John, when he said that Jesus gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everybody. And that light then shines in the darkness, and the darkness will never be able to extinguish it. But the fact remains, there is darkness all around us. Every day. That was true in Jesus' day. It was true in Paul's day. It's true today. And friends, the darkness is real. Don't ever let anyone try to convince you that there isn't a power of evil that is at work in this world today. There is darkness. And as followers of Jesus Christ, we are people of light. It's what Jesus was talking about in the greatest sermon that was ever preached, the Sermon on the Mount. Do you remember what he said? He's talking about, kind of after the Beatitudes part, he talks about how we're to get his message out into the world. And he uses two word pictures to try to help us understand how it is that we're to get his message out. And do you remember what those word pictures are? He says first in Matthew 5:13, you are the salt of the earth. Remember what the other one is? You are the what? Light of the world. I mean, of all the word pictures that Jesus could have used at his disposal, he chose these two, salt and light. Salt. Now, I want to say just a little bit about salt. There's something important to know about salt. You don't just pile a load of salt on top of a piece of food in order to make it taste good, do you? I mean, yeah, it tastes awful, right? What do? You sprinkle a little salt. I know doctors will tell you you're not supposed to do that, but since when do doctors know what tastes good and what doesn't taste good? So you just sprinkle a little salt on the food. Louis Palau has one of the greatest statements. He says, Christians are like manure. You pile them up in one place and they don't do any good. All they do is just stink. But you spread them out and they do a lot of good. Stuff starts growing. That's the way it is with salt, you know? You just sprinkle a little salt around and it transforms this old, bland, tasteless earth and it suddenly finds that there's something worth living for. And then there's the light. Do you remember what Jesus said about the light? He said nobody takes a light and hides it under a bushel basket, but they put it on a stand so that everybody in the house can experience the power of that light that dispels the darkness. That's how we're called to live. To let our light shine. You know, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. We're called to let that light that is within us shine through us so that the way in which we live our lives causes that light to dispel the darkness that's around us so that people, when they see that happening, they will recognize that God is at work in our lives. Which brings up an important point. And I've got to always remember that I don't generate the light. You don't generate the light. No matter how many Red Bulls you might drink, no matter how many cups of coffee you might consume, you cannot generate the light. Do you remember what happened in creation? God made the sun and God made the moon. The sun was called the greater light and the moon was called the lesser light. And the sun, like God, is always giving out light. And the moon, on the other hand, the moon doesn't generate any light at all. In fact, the moon lives in darkness, but the light of the sun shining on the moon causes the moon to begin to shine. We call that moonlight, right? The truth of the matter is, though, there's no such thing as the moon generating light. The light we see from the moon is just reflected sunlight. Mark Twain was right, I think. We're all like the moon. We all have a dark side that we don't want anybody to see. But the sun has no dark side. The sun is always putting out light, like God. And the light that comes to the moon and the light that comes from the moon is reflected light. And so it is with every single one of us. Neither you nor I self-generate light. The light we give as children of God is reflected light. It's kind of like a mirror. If I were to hold a mirror up and to one of these spotlights, I could turn it in such a way that it would make it uncomfortable for you to look up here because of the way the light reflected off of that mirror. That's how we're called to live. As mirrors, reflecting the light of love. I mean, it's how we love. Do you think that we created love? No. The scripture's clear. We love, in 1 John 4:19, we love because he first loved us. So now, as people who've given your lives to Jesus, this is what Paul says back to Ephesians 5. He says, now you have light from the Lord, so live as people of light. Take no part in the worthless deeds of evil and darkness. Instead, expose them. It's shameful even to talk about the things that ungodly people do in secret. But their evil intentions will be exposed with the light shining on them. For the light makes everything visible. This is why it said, awake, O sleeper, rise up from the dead, and Christ will give you light. So be careful how you live. Don't live like fools, but live like those who are wise. Make the most of every opportunity in these evil days. Don't act thoughtlessly, but understand what the Lord wants you to do. Are you beginning to get the picture of what it looks like to let your faith guide you in all of the relationships that you have, especially with your friends? I mean, as Christians, you have a responsibility to reflect the light of Jesus everywhere you go and in every situation you walk into. In fact, there is never a time when it's permissible to drop your guard and to try to turn it off. I mean, Paul's fellow apostle Peter would say on another occasion in 1 Peter 3:15, he said, always, not every once in a while, but always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. In other words, if somebody sees the joy that you have in your life, be ready to tell the other person why that is you have that joy. Always be ready. Always be ready. Don't think that this is something that you can turn off and on with a light switch. I mean, you just reflect the light of God wherever it is you go. And sometimes, here's a consequence of that. Sometimes when you reflect the light of God, it's going to expose the darkness in others around you. But when that happens, when the opportunity comes to expose the darkness that resides in another person, don't do it in a mean or condescending way. I mean, we are not called by God to beat other people up with our faith. Since when did you ever hear about a person coming to faith in Jesus because they lost a fight? People come to faith in Jesus because they've been loved into that relationship with him. But at the same time, we are not allowed by God to ignore the encroaching darkness into another person's life. I mean, our silence at times could sometimes be interpreted as approval. It's why we're called to speak the truth in love. As long as I live, I don't think I'll ever forget Mary Pearson. Mary was in my high school history class. And I'll tell you, I grew up in junior high and high school, living a pretty sheltered life. And I moved to Houston, and I had not yet met the love of my life, Jana, but we were in the same school together, and it was early in my senior year, and I got invited by some friends to go to a party. And I had really just moved into the area like 5 or 6 months earlier, and so I was still very image conscious. And so these friends invited me to go to a party with them, and I had never gone to a party in my entire life. And so I went. And I got there, and sure enough, the parents were gone, and there was alcohol flowing freely, and I had never drank a drop of alcohol. And so guess what I did? I picked up a beer, and I carried it around with me the whole night. I carried it around. And every time I'd come up to a plant, I'd pour a little bit out in the plant. And I'd just walk around. I didn't drink any of it. I promise you, I didn't drink it, but I carried it around with me. And then finally it was empty, and I was able to put it down. And went home later that night, went to school on Monday, and Mary Pearson sat behind me in my world history class, and we had just finished executing gummy bears as we talked about capital punishment. Crazy thing. And it's the things I learned in high school. And Mary handed me a note. And I opened up the note. And it said, "Jerry, I just want you to know I'm disappointed in you. I saw you at the party the other night. And I didn't think you were like that. And I just wanted you to know I'm disappointed in you." I'll never forget that. You know, she was maybe even unwittingly reflecting God's light into my life. That was God's way, I think, of getting his message to me to wake up, O sleeper, and rise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. She didn't share that in a mean way. She didn't expose the darkness in me in a mean way or in a condescending way, but in a very loving way, and it made a difference. Friends, you know, as I've been thinking about it, our friendships may provide for some of us the most fertile mission fields that we might ever step into. Our friendships. So I want to ask you this question. When you leave here today, having heard what you've heard, how are you going to act differently in your friendships with your friends? What are you going to do differently? What's going to change? Or are you just going to sort of leave this here and say, that's a nice message, not really applicable to me? I want to leave you with this. This is Eugene Peterson's translation of what Jesus said about light in the Sermon on the Mount. This is Matthew 5:14-16 from the Message translation. I love this, and I'll leave you with this. Here's another way to put it. You're here to be light, bringing out the God colors in the world. God is not a secret to be kept. We're going public with this, as public as a city on a hill. If I make you light bearers, you don't think I'm going to hide you under a bucket, do you? No, I'm putting you on a light stand. Now that I've put you there on a hilltop, on a light stand, shine. Keep open house. Be generous with your lives. By opening up to others, you'll prompt people to open up with God, this generous Father in heaven. And so I say to every one of us in this room, myself included, as followers of Jesus Christ, we are bearers of the light of God. So our task in our relationships with our friends is to shine. To shine. In whatever way he affords you the opportunity to do so. To shine. Sometimes it might require words. Sometimes it might require a touch. Sometimes it might require a presence, just being there. But I know this, if we will listen to his direction and just shine as he directs, we will experience blessing beyond measure. And so will our friends. Let's pray. Gracious God.